Our first speaker up is Dr. Michael Wunsch. He's a plant pathologist from North Dakota State University's Carrington Research Extension Center. His research and outreach efforts are primarily focused on addressing disease management problems in broadleaf crops grown in North Dakota, with an emphasis on improving the management of white mold in dry edible beans, soybeans, and sunflowers, and improving the management of root and foliar diseases in field peas, chickpeas, and lentils. He obtained his BSc from the University of Missouri and his PhD from Cornell University, and he commenced his employment with the North Dakota Research Center in Carrington in 2010. Originally from Montana, Michael started his career in the Peace Corps a long time ago, working in vegetable crops in a humid, cool and humid environment, which obviously was very conducive to him studying diseases. So with that, we will take it away with Michael. Michael will also be here till the end of the day, so if there are questions that we can't answer in the session, Mike will be here till the end of the day, and then he has to return back to the States.
All right, listen, I was asked to talk today primarily about fungicide resistance. We all know that anyone growing field peas, though, has to deal with root diseases. And I'm going to split the time between root disease management and foliar disease management. Those of you who are familiar with the program that I run, my team and I run out of Carrington, we focus on very practical disease management. Research that can be readily implemented. And so I will be sharing those results on these two subject areas from our program on these two subjects. Okay, first off, QOI resistance. So resistance to the Strobe or QOI FRAC 11 fungicides was first reported in Alberta, oh gosh, close to 2 decades ago, right? And so it was just a matter of time till it showed up in North Dakota. This is what it looks like. So the QOI fungicides, when you get resistance, it's like a light switch. And so it's not that the fungicide declines in efficacy, it just loses efficacy. And so these are data from Headline and Quadris. We've seen the exact same thing with what you guys call acapella up here from Corteva, because it's another of these QOI fungicides. And here you can see our disease control in our fungicide studies. The blue dots would be the headline. The brown dots are the Quadris. And you can see through 2015, yeah, there's some noise because disease pressure differed by years, but we consistently got disease control after that, not so much. Here's the yield response, and that's really looking ugly from 2016 on, okay? And certainly not what you want to see. Again, some of those studies before then just didn't have a lot of pressure, hence no yield response. But after that, you never get a yield response. So that's what resistance looks like. The triazole fungicides, so FRAC 3, okay, nowadays what we're using primarily is prothioconazole, which is sold in Proline and also various premixes like Delero or Proline Gold, as you guys call it up here, from Bayer, and I think it's in Revipro from BSF and Cotega from BSF that's sold up here but not in the U.S. And anyhow, this is a triazole. Triazoles are multi-site mode of action fungicides. So resistance in these fungicides builds up gradually. And what you expect is a gradual erosion in efficacy. And this certainly isn't proof of that. We do have laboratory testing to confirm the QOI resistance, but in this case, there's no laboratory testing. I'm just showing what we see in our field trials. And you can see over time from 2010 to the present, you see what is consistent with what we'd expect with a gradual erosion of efficacy. And here's the yield response. Again, it's still performing, it's still working, but you can see a gradual erosion in efficacy. All right, and so this is why we do want to always try to rotate our fungicide modes of action if we can. But for Ascochyta or Mycosphera blight, whoever you want to call it, same disease, different name of peas, we unfortunately don't have a lot of choices. Okay, you have your triazoles. Okay, so prothioconazole, methyltrifluconazole from BSF. I don't know if you guys have difenoconazole up here. Syngenta sells that in the U.S. I guess the labels are a little different across the border, but no worries. Methyltrifluconazole and prothioconazole are the top triazoles, okay? Difenoconazole is good, but not quite as good, so no loss if you guys don't have it. But basically, you have the triazoles and you have your SDHIs. And the SDHIs are it's a FRAC 7 code. And so Priaxor, which you guys, okay, I think you guys have Priaxor up here, but I know you have the same active ingredients in a product called Diax up here. But the ratio of actives is different than Diax. So Priaxor is really heavy on the FRAC 7, the SDHI fungicide, and less heavy on the QI. Okay, so this is a premix of headline and the SDHI. And Diax is also premixed, but it's a 1-to-1 ratio. All right, and so here you have Priaxor, and these are only data from 2016 on, after we had strobe resistance. So this is essentially a standalone FRAC 7 fungicide because the headline's doing nothing. Okay, and what you can see from the average data on the right across all these studies is that you can see that the Priaxor is intermediate in efficacy. Okay, so fluxaperoxide, which is the SDHI active, it has efficacy, but it's not quite as good as Proline. Okay, now this is the 4 fluid ounce rate. You go up to a 6 fluid ounce rate, and I have the mils up there for, you know, the mixed units you guys use up here. But you'll see now with a 6 fluid ounce rate, the efficacy is a little bit closer to Proline. Okay, you can see that the difference in the disease control narrows. And so what my point is this. If you are using fluxaperoxide, say Diax, or you're using Priaxor, if you can get it up here, the rate that you apply it at matters, okay? There's definitely a rate response, okay? And that's my point here. Now, you have essentially 4 options for SDHI fungicides, okay? You have fluxaperoxide from BASF, okay? You have adepidin from Syngenta. Okay, these 2 are pretty good Ascochyta fungicides. Okay, they're not quite as good as Proline, okay, but they're pretty good. You can see here, it's pretty good. All right, not quite as good as Proline, but pretty good. Your other 2 SDHIs, major SDHIs, are Boscalid, which would be the AI in Lance from BASF, and fluopyram, which is the AI in what you guys call Proline Gold up here. Okay, we call it Propulse down there, down the US. Okay, now, Boscalid and fluopyram are not as good against the Ascochyta. Okay, and I have a slide right here showing the data for Boscalid. So Endura, which is the same as Lance. Okay, here's Endura applied at 6 or 8 ounces, which is very expensive, by the way. And you can see that the efficacy here really does not compare favorably to Proline. Okay, and this is my point. Fluopyram and Boscalid are not very good SDHIs against Ascochyta. Okay, adepidin, on the other hand, and fluxaperoxide are fairly good. Okay, now your other triazole that's pretty good is methyltrifluconazole. Okay, and ReviPro from BASF is a premix of this and the Proline, and basically Proline. Okay, but what I want to show here is the application rate of methyltrifluconazole matters. Okay, and so this is Provisol, which is a standalone methyltrifluconazole, which I think you guys have registers only on potatoes up here. I think it's Sevia or something like that. But at any rate, down there it's registered as a standalone on peas. And here it is at a 3 fluid ounce rate, and you can see it's just not quite as good as the Proline. Okay, now you get that Provisol up to 5 fluid ounces, and you can see the difference narrows a little bit. But 5 fluid ounces of Provisol does not contain as much of the active ingredient as 5.7 fluid ounces of Proline. Okay, and so what you really want to think about when you're applying methyltrifluconazole or prothioconazole, you really want to think about how much of the AI am I putting on? All right, because these two fungicides are very, very similar in terms of their efficacy against Ascochyta in terms of a per AI basis. Okay, and so per grams of AI. Okay, and so and as far as resistance management, they're identical. Now, the other SDHI that I mentioned that works pretty well is Adepidin from Syngenta. Now, the main product that's utilized on peas in the United States that has Adepidin in it is a premix of Adepidin with difenoconazole. Now, to my knowledge, that isn't registered up here. You guys have Miravis Neo. Now, Miravis Neo is essentially a standalone SDHI. Okay, in my experience using Miravis Neo, we have only used it a little bit tested a little bit on peas. We tested it more on chickpeas, but the efficacy against Ascochyta on these two crops is really similar. Okay, is that you want to think of Miravis Neo as kind of like a Priaxor or a Diax. Okay, all right, and propiconazole just doesn't work, and of course the quadrus component doesn't work against Ascochyta. Okay. So again, your tools are really limited. You've got your triazoles, primarily Proline, and then methyltrifluconazole from BSF, and then your two SDHIs that work pretty well. Okay. Now be really careful with the SDHIs. They are just like the strobies. Resistance is complete with a single mutation. Okay. And so it's really easy to lose those. All right, so with that would be the resistance management discussion on field peas for Ascochyta. Questions before I go into root rot? No questions. Okay, so what I want to discuss now for the remainder of the time I have here. Oh, okay, there's one last thing. There is one more tool in the toolbox. I don't know if it's registered up here yet. It is registered in the United States, but it's basically irrelevant because of the price. It's the fungicide Allegro, as it's called up here, or Omega, fluazanam. Okay, this works against Ascochyta quite well. It's very expensive, and it's a different mode of action. But I guess if everything else fails, it might be an option. All right, so what I want to do is I want to transition to root rot because this is the juggernaut for field peas. Okay, anyone who's grown field peas for any length of time has to deal with root rot issues. And the major root rot problem, of course, is this Fusarium and Aphanomyces root rot and wilt complex. And what you're dealing with here is the Aphanomyces root rot, Fusarium root rot, and then various strains of Fusarium wilt. All right, and it's a mixture of all of them, and you just got to manage the whole thing as a combined approach here. All right, now the dogma that usually you hear is that if you have a field that's been lost to severe root rot, that you need to rotate out for 8 years or so. Okay, that's the standard recommendation. The guys who have done this without implementing any other practices that I've heard about, they've all gotten burned when they go back after 8 years. Okay. And so what I'm here to tell you, though, is that you can manage this by integrating crop rotation with other practices, is what it appears to be, okay? So we ran some very, very rigorous planting day studies in fields with a natural history of this root rot complex. All the fields tested positive for Aphanomyces, for various Fusarium root rot causing Fusarium species, and for Fusarium excisperum and had the wilt symptoms. We did not go out and go out and figure out exactly what races of Fusarium wilt were present in each one of these fields. But every one of these fields had all three of these components in it. We had fields at the Carrington Research Center. We had on-farm sites south of Minot, okay, in 2 different counties south of Minot. We had an on-farm site north of Williston. So we're looking at a pretty diverse geography across North Dakota. We ran these studies over 4 years with 3 planting dates, okay? And basically what we learned is that early planting can help significantly with this root rot management. But when you go with early planting, you have got to use a fungicide seed treatment. And it's not for the Fusarium or Aphanomyces. is that when you plant really early, you end up getting rhizoctonium pythium issues. Okay, and so the seed treatment is to protect against the rhizoctonium pythium that comes in really early. Okay, it has nothing to do with Fusarium and Phantomyces. It's just that you're planting early. And so basically, if you plant really early, you gain yourself 4 to 8 bushels in these fields. If you add that seed treatment with planting really early, you gain yourself another 4 to 6 bushels on top of that. Okay, and then you add in the crop rotation, and we're only talking 5 years out of peas. And it looks like you can gain about 9 bushels versus a 3-year rotation. So you add all of these. Now, this last year, we added another component to this research. We expanded this. And what we are now looking at is also adding the component of using varieties that have, how do you say this best? Better tolerance to this root rot complex. There is no complete resistance, but the varieties differ in their tolerance. And this matters, okay? Now, we don't know enough about the basis of the differences in the tolerance yet to know how replicable these will be across sites. Because if you're just looking at differences in Fusarium wilt resistance, it's going to depend on what strains of Fusarium wilt you have. But if you have differences in tolerance to the Fusarium root rot and a Phantomyces root rot, that's going to be stable. All right, and what we saw this last year is that adding a variety that we know has pretty good tolerance to the Fusarium root rot, not just wilt, and Phantomyces is another piece in the puzzle that can really help, okay? And what you've got to do is if you've got one of these root rot fields, you've got to stack these management techniques, each of which has partial efficacy. And if you stack enough of these partial efficacy tools, you're going to end up with a decent crop. Okay, but if you only use one of the techniques, say crop rotation, you're going to get burned. All right, or just early planting, you're going to get burned. Okay, you've got to stack tools. So here are the results from these planting date studies. And what you have on the top bar is the root rot severity across all the studies that were planted, all the planting dates that were planted at a given soil temperature. And then on the bottom is a relative root rot severity versus the maximum across planting dates. And so what's the soil temperature data? Okay, we put data logging soil temperature sensors at seeding depth, and this is the average soil temperature day and night. If you want it in centigrade, you got to do the math, okay? But basically, 41 to 45 degrees, if you were at 41 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit at seeding depth in the week after planting, day and night average, you can see that you got way less root rot, and that held even up to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And for a practical rule of thumb, this coincides to usually when people are just starting to plant wheat. Okay, but you can actually utilize this information. If you know what your day-night seeding soil temperature is right now, and you know what the forecast is, you can make a really educated guess where you're going to sit. All right, but this makes lots of sense if you think about it. Fusarium and a Phantomyces, whether it's the Fusarium root rot or Fusarium wilt, and then a Phantomyces, these are warm soil pathogens. Peas, they can tolerate frost. They can tolerate it cold. What you're doing here is you're giving the peas a running start before the soil temperatures get warm enough for the root rot to really take off. So basically, the peas get a running start, and then when the root rot finally comes in because the soil temperatures have warmed up enough for them, well, they're a lot bigger. All right, it's kind of like the difference between your 6-year-old getting a certain bug and your newborn. All right, I'd rather have the 6-year-old getting the bug than the newborn, okay? And so same idea here, all right? And so very well, that's this component. Here's the yield. Okay, what you can see, even though we minimize root rot, the very, very low soil temperatures, we didn't maximize yield there. We maximize yield between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And but I'll give you a caution. This was the average between fungicide-treated and non-fungicide-treated, i.e. naked seed. All right? When we got into the really cold soils, we had emergence problems through the Pythium and Rhizoctonia. Okay, so here is the response to treating the seed in these same studies, okay, with what you guys call Ensure Pulse versus naked seed. And what you can see here is, again, there's the soil temperature day and night in the 7 days after planting, okay? And you can see the naked seed versus the seed treatment, all right? What you can see is that you're getting a 4 to 6 bushel response to a seed treatment that really just has efficacy against Pythium and Rhizoctonia. And then once the soil temperatures get warm enough that it's not very favorable for Rhizoctonia or Pythium, suddenly you don't get much of a response to the seed treatment anymore, all right? And so this is not a seed treatment for Fusarium or Phantomyces. This is for Pythium and Rhizoc. If you plant into soils that are average 43 degrees Fahrenheit day and night at seeding depth in the 7 days after planting, and you have any moisture at all, you know, it's high risk for the traditional, seed rotting pathogens. All right, and so this is just shows the reduction in the improvement in emergence and reduction in root rot that we saw. Again, the reduction in root rot we saw with the seed treatment is really in the really cold soil temperatures. We're talking primarily Rhizoc. All right. All right. The next seed treatment that we tested another seed treatment on some of the studies, and this is a seed treatment that included a component with efficacy against Fusarium. Okay, there's a new BSF product that has methyltrifluconazole. It's going to be performed very similar to this, I assume. Here we added Proline, which is a good Fusarium product. What you can see here is that yield response to the seed treatment held even with late planting. Okay, because now we're getting some efficacy against Fusarium. That said, you still don't want to plant late. Okay, your yields are still maximized by planting early. Okay, you can't use a seed treatment to manage your Fusarium root rot. Okay, you need to plant early to manage Fusarium as a management tool for Fusarium root rot, and then you put on the seed treatment for Pythium and Rhizoc. Okay, so and to emphasize that point here is some testing we did with ethoboxam. So in this case, we took Ensure Pulse, we tested that alone or added ethoboxam, which is an AI that has efficacy against the Phantomyces. And what you can see is that adding ethoboxam had no effect at all on yield when the soil temperatures are cold. No surprise, Phantomyces isn't active. Okay? Once the soil temperatures got really warm, well, then you started getting yield response, but it still wasn't enough to make up for the late planting. All right? So you can't use a fungicide seed treatment to take care of your Phantomyces or Fusarium. All right? And what you're seeing, yeah, it helps a little bit when you're planting too late in these root rot fields, okay? But not enough to compensate for the late planting, all right? So the big problem with ethoboxam, you see this in this emergence chart. You see that we had an increase in emergence at very cold soil temperatures with ethoboxam by adding ethoboxam, and that's because ethoboxam helps with Pythium. Okay, you had an increase in emergence in really warm soils, okay, by adding ethoboxam, and that's because you actually had some Phantomyces causing, stand decline when you had really warm soils. But in the middle, adding ethoboxam reduced emergence. What does that mean? Phytotoxic. Okay, ethoboxam is a little bit phytotoxic to peas. All right, and this is well documented, it's well known. Okay, so anyway, save yourself the money. All right, the last thing I want to mention is crop rotation. We've been running 2 simple crop rotation studies ever since 2014, one down in Hettinger, a site that had never seen field peas before, okay, or lentils. And anyhow, when we got to year 2020, we could finally compare a 6-year rotation versus a 3-year versus a 2-year. And what you can see is that we had a significant reduction in root rot with that 6-year rotation. And if you look at the 4-year rotation versus the 2-year, you can see the root rot starting to build up, all right? But the 4-year rotation isn't enough to prevent the buildup of the root rot. So basically what this is suggesting is that if you keep a 6-year rotation, 5 years out of peas, that it may help with the buildup of the root rot. Okay, and here is the root rot severity in the 2-year rotation. And you can see that 2014, when we started this, there was no root rot. By 2018, which was the 3rd year we had grown peas there was still hardly any root rot, but then it started to take off. And that's pretty consistent. About the fourth time we grew peas in the site, you started to see quite a bit of root rot. All right, and now we ran the same crop rotation study in Carrington. What you can see here is that, again, that 4-year rotation, it helps with root rot, but it's not enough. So this is 3 years out of peas. Okay, when we had the 6-year rotation, oh, well, that's finally getting in the territory that will work. You see, we have 47 bushels. Now, that's the average across fungicide-treated and non-treated seed. All right, and here you are. This is something I want to emphasize here. This would be the root rot severity that we saw in the 2-year rotation. You look at that 2-year rotation across years, you see how it jumps around? We're always assessing at early vegetative growth, but 1 year it's 85%, another year it's 26%. Well, look at the soil temperatures at which we planted. And you can see that the root rot severity at that early vegetative growth correlates very strongly. I know it's only 4 data points, but it's certainly supportive of what we've seen before, that the root rot severity, as you're going into that early vegetative growth, is highly dependent on what soil temperatures those peas experience between planting and that growth stage. All right, and so here are the data from the 2 versus 3 versus 6-year rotation. That particular year, we planted when the soil temperatures were an average 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the 7 days after planting. Optimal, absolutely optimal. So perfect soil temperature for root rot. And now, but I want to show you here, if we had used no seed treatment with that 6-year rotation, we would have had a 44 bushel yield. With the Ensure Pulse against the Pythium and Rhizoc, we had a 49 bushel yield. We actually lost a bushel by adding ethoboxam. Targeting Aphanomyces. If we had gone with a 3-year rotation and no seed treatment, we'd been all the way down to 35 bushel yield. Okay, so what this is suggesting is that if you have a root rot problem in these fields, you need to stack management strategies. You need to go in really early when the soil temperatures are cold. You need to use a fungicide seed treatment then against Pythium and Rhizoc. Okay, and you want to be 5 years out of peas or lentils, okay? And you don't need to be, from what our data suggests, 8 years out, okay? And then I would suggest, we're following up on this rigorously now, but you want to be looking for some of these varieties that are a little bit more tolerant of this root rot complex. And there are some out there, okay? You can add all those together and you can have a pretty good shot at a good crop. If you have a field that you believe has a root rot problem and you cannot plant in a timely manner, my suggestion to producers across the geography that I cover, which is North Dakota into Montana, is that you punt. Okay, you can't plant early, and you know that field is a root rot field, you punt and you plant another broadleaf crop or another crop that year, and you wait till you can plant early. If, on the other hand, is a field without a root rot problem, well, oftentimes these peas do fine planted late, okay? But on these root rot fields, you don't want to plant late. All right, so with that, I have no idea how I did for time. 3:33, we're good. We're good.
You're really good.
Do we gold mine today? So, any questions?
Edgar with Western Ag. Just curious about crop rotation, and can you comment at all about inclusion of oats in the rotation? There's some literature suggesting that it can be a ghost crop, if that's the right term, but that will encourage Aphanomyces to grow, but then there's not the pulses there to sustain it.
Yeah, so I don't have, we did not test oats in our rotation, so I just don't have experience with it. So I just don't know. I'd just be guessing.
We have one question that came online. What varieties are you using in the study that are moderately tolerant to Aphanomyces?
All right, so this year we followed up on this crop rotation, on this planting date research. So my previous boss, I like to say he loved peas to death. Okay, it's a bit of a joke. He really loved peas. And so he did a lot of foundation seed increase. We have about 1,500 acres in Carrington. And he bestowed upon me a great resource for testing root rot because he grew peas on too tight a rotation. Anyhow, so we went on to 11 fields in Carrington. Some of these fields were otherwise similar in crop rotation history, but we just happened to have a field P variety study that I could go on top of that were, say, 4 years out. So anyhow, we had an opportunity to test crop rotation interval in a non-replicated manner, but across multiple fields. I mean, because, getting a crop rotation study going, you're talking years, right? But in this study, what we did was we tested 2 varieties with and without seed treatment on 4 planting dates. And by the luck of the draw, and I didn't actually purposely choose this, we chose it. We had 2 varieties that are dramatically different in their tolerance to root rot. And talking to colleagues, they've seen this in their screening nurseries. So AAC Julius was a very good performer in these studies. I'm still working on waiting on the diagnostic test results to see exactly what pathogen mix we had in each of these fields. But I mean, our other variety we had in there that we were comparing to was AAC Profit. Okay, the Julius in the really bad fields, I mean, we're talking 10 to 30 bushel responses under really bad root rot pressure. It really shined. Okay, and so that said, the tolerant variety, Julius in this case, alone is insufficient as a management tool. With late planting, you're still looking at, well, it was like one of the fields was like 38 versus 9 bushel yields. And Julius versus Profit. And I'm sorry, 38 bushels doesn't cut it. Okay, so, but we couldn't get in until May 23rd because of how wet it was. So with early planting, that would have worked. Okay, and that was a pretty tight crop rotation interval. So crop rotation, early planting, tolerant variety, seed treatment, and you've got a hope.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Okay.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.